makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
So Bill Gates began the coronavirus pandemic as a supervillain because he was going to put microchips on vaccines and make us all become controlled by, I guess, Microsoft. Not sure what he planned to do with humanity under his control. Perhaps buy licensed copies of Microsoft Office instead of pirating it or using Google Docs. I don't know what his great plan was with those microchips. Of course, this was all false. This was just conspiracy theories. But behind every conspiracy theory, almost, let me retract that, some of them. Let's not get into flat Earth. But behind many conspiracy theories, there is at least a grain of truth. And it turns out that Bill Gates did kind of become the great supervillain of the coronavirus pandemic. One of many supervillains. Let's not forget all the absolutely terrible populist leaders who have botched the pandemic in their countries, and due to their hatred of lockdowns and care for businesses rather than people, have led to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people dying who probably wouldn't have died if they had taken um, more uh, caring and scientifically minded policies. I'm talking about the Donald Trumps, the Boris Johnsons, the Jair Bolsonaros, the Andres Manuel Lopez Obradors. Um, there's a long list, but Bill Gates ended up being a supervillain, not so much because of the microchips, but because of his intervention, very untimely intervention, to the original plan for Oxford University to release the IP of its vaccine. So this would have been essentially an open source vaccine for the rest of the world. So any company in the world who was capable of manufacturing vaccines and which had the technological capacity and sophistication to produce specifically the Oxford vaccines would be able to do it. But as it turned out, Bill Gates, who, because of his immense wealth, uh, has essentially become something as a global pontiff of health through the his foundation, which has a presence in many developing countries around the world, has an oversized influence in health policy, which has been very strongly criticized for not necessarily being the right policies. So, for example, a criticism that has been levied on his foundation is that they seem to prioritize uh, diseases or illnesses that can be very publicly shown to have been eradicated. Whereas the grand majority of people in developing countries die of illnesses that aren't necessarily, like, for example, viral or bacterial. So, uh, digestive diseases are a huge cause of deaths in the developing world. And these usually have structural factors, poverty, lack of services, etc. It's not really easy to just introduce a vaccine and stop children in Africa from dying of diarrhea, for example. So these are, I guess, um, ugly diseases in the sense that there's no sense of achievement that you've eradicated them the way that, for example, you can do with polio or by introducing a vaccine. Um, See what I mean? So, aside from that, there's the fact that I guess no one person, especially someone who doesn't have a medical background, should really have such an enormous influence on global health policy. And it would be, and his influence has been not just on health. In the US, for example, he's had a major impact on education policy, which has been a disaster. Bill Gates has promoted this sort of metric-based education, introducing metric-based policies in education that have actually proven to not work. And there's been studies that shown that the policies that he's pushed forward in U.S. education have worsened outcomes. So Bill Gates, his intervention to prevent the Oxford vaccine to become a public intellectual property has undoubtedly reduced the amount of vaccines that we have to meet the global supply. Why? Because it means that only companies that obtain licensing agreements with these companies will be able to manufacture vaccines. So only a certain quantity of global vaccine manufacturing capability is currently focused on developing and producing COVID vaccines. So that's the issue. And there is a huge global outcry right now. There is a debate going on in the WTO for IP waivers to be provided so that developing countries that can produce vaccines could produce COVID vaccines without worrying that they're violating IP property, intellectual property. So Bill Gates appeared on Sky News a couple of days ago, and he was asked about this. And we're going to hear his very flippant and categorical denial that IP waivers could have any use.
And in terms of that, there's been some speculation that the changing intellectual property rules and allowing these vaccines, as you say, the recipe for these vaccines to be shared would be helpful. Do you think that would be helpful?
No.
Why not?
Well, there's only so many vaccine factories in the world, and people are very serious about the safety of vaccines. And so moving something that had never been done, moving a vaccine from, say, a J&J factory into a factory in India, that it's novel. It's only because of our grants and our expertise that can happen at all. The thing that's holding things back in this case is not intellectual property. There's not like some idle vaccine factory with regulatory approval that makes magically safe vaccines. You've got to do the trials on these things, and every manufacturing process has to be looked at in a very careful way.
So here's the thing. That happens with any medical, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's a medical treatment, that happens everywhere. It's not a special case that a factory, a vaccine factory in South Africa would have to obviously have some degree of quality control. And ex ante, we don't know whether any factory is going to produce vaccines or any other medical product satisfactorily. But here's the thing. This happens as well in the rich countries. This happens with the very companies that are producing vaccines. And in fact, it just happened now when one of the factories that was meant to produce Johnson & Johnson vaccines ended up botching millions of doses, and they have to throw out an entire batch that was produced in this Baltimore factory. So there you have it. This isn't unique to another country producing vaccines from one particular Western company, right? So clearly there is some degree of quality control that every factory must undertake, and governments would also have to ensure that there is regulation for this quality control. But I'm pretty sure that there's plenty of vaccine makers around the world, or generic medical producing companies that could do it. That could pull it off. Not just the ones that were lucky enough to obtain licensing agreements. So what he's describing is a situation that A, is not unique to the developing world. It clearly happens even in the most scientifically advanced country on earth, that a factory producing vaccines botched some. So by his logic, this shouldn't happen, right? Because clearly the US has the standards, and companies like Johnson & Johnson have the standards. So this just shouldn't happen. And I haven't heard this happen, say, from the Serum Institute in India's production of AstraZeneca vaccines. So, you know, I don't think this is a valid argument of why, you know, we should be worried that vaccine makers in the developing world are somehow going to just botch it all. This is ridiculous.
There's all sorts of issues around intellectual property having to do with medicines, but not in terms of how quickly we've been able to ramp up the volume here. You know, I remember how shocked people were when we said we were going to do second sources in these developing country factories. You know, that was a novel thing. We got all the rights from the vaccine companies. They didn't hold it back. They were participating. I do a regular phone call with the pharmaceutical CEOs to make sure that work is going at full speed.
So
that's actually really worrying, that he has like regular phone calls with the CEOs of major pharmaceuticals. That, you know, for like I said, no man or woman who really his life work hasn't been in the medical industry should have that outsized power over something. Like, his foundation influences health policy, and the poorer the country is, the more it will rely on the funding of his foundation. So he can basically make or break a country's health policy. He can mold it to his liking. I've read, you know, stories of just how influential he is. Like, the UN can fire experts because he doesn't like them, or because they're criticizing him, or because they're promoting policies different from what his foundation is promoting. So that's how much power he has, and it's really worrying that he just basically admits that he's coordinating all this, and you know, again, he's saying that it's possible that, you know, this already happened with the second sourcing of, for example, the Serum Institute in India. But these type of agreements have to be basically enacted or approved voluntarily by the pharmaceutical companies, and they can decide not to participate at all. And a good example of this is Moderna. So Moderna, which basically funded its vaccine practically entirely through public efforts, recently announced that it was not going to enforce IP protection on its vaccine, which received a lot of praise. This was like, oh wow, you know, how altruistic of them. Of course, that didn't mean that they shared the details of how to make this vaccine at all. And in fact, they're the only major vaccine, COVID vaccine producer that isn't participating in the COVAX scheme. So how's that for altruism?
it's not that's slowing it down. More money would help. More vaccines physically would help as well, wouldn't it? How hard is it to get the countries that have the vaccines, and obviously, you know, here in the UK we have enough to vaccinate our population 5 times over. What are your feelings about that?
Well, over the balance of the year, the US, the UK, and others will be able to make sure that the vaccines are now going to the developing countries. Because many of the vaccines worked, you know, although we're looking at, you know, some of the side effects now and making sure we can treat those and that they're very rare, that good news means that we will be able to supply others. And The other good news is that the actual death rate from this epidemic in the poorest countries has actually been quite low. And so the places where, you want to get everyone over 60 vaccinated, like South Africa, Brazil, that will become a priority just in the next, 3 or 4 months.
So he's saying that the poorest countries have been relatively mildly affected, which is partly true. If you look at the poorest country, say in Sub-Saharan Africa, Africa's done pretty well. It has young populations. They're relatively healthy populations as well. So they've done okay. But then he mentions South Africa and Brazil, and both of these countries have been hit pretty bad. Brazil just a couple of months ago was having the most horrific outbreak of COVID in the world. It's only been overtaken now by India in terms of the amount of daily deaths in a single country. And what's most... So he says, well, in a couple of months, Western countries will be able to give their surplus away. And a couple of months is just not necessarily quick enough, because we know how quickly this vaccine can hit countries that just a month ago were doing fine. And an example of this is India. India, 1 month ago, so March 26-ish, was still doing well. We could clearly see the slope increasing, so this was when things were starting to get bad. But if you were in India, say early March, and you could have reasonably said, yeah, we're sort of past the worst. And then you look at the numbers in early April, and it's considerably higher. And as we get into May, it's just going to be absolutely outrageous. So this is a disease where we learned from the first wave that 1 month can make or break you. In fact, 2 weeks can make or break you. So the idea that countries like the UK are hoarding such a huge amount of vaccines, that the US has had a stock of AstraZeneca vaccines that it hasn't approved, but somehow it possesses, and only now is willing to share it, only now when they see how bad the situation in India is really like, well, these countries could have started sharing them earlier. Like the UK infection curve has pretty much been stabilized. Not now, but over a month ago. So you can really see those charts and you can say, well, maybe it's time. Clearly we haven't vaccinated our full population, but we're almost at the level of reaching herd immunity, which is around 60% of the population. We can start sharing now. We don't have to wait until 100% of our population has been vaccinated. We can do it now. So, he's saying next couple of months, when is this going to happen? When are we going to see more sustained action from Western countries?
Is when the U.S. will move into that excess position and take these Act A resources and use them to get those vaccination levels up as fast as we possibly can. It is true that there's been about a 4-month gap that, depending on what happens with J&J, could be over 6 months. Typically in global health, it takes a decade between when a vaccine comes into the rich world and when it gets to the poor countries. So
I explained this in a previous video, that part of the reason why vaccine development has been so quick during the coronavirus pandemic is because there's so many cases that you can easily do a phase 3 trials, which would take years in a situation where you don't have that many concurrent infections. Like, it's really easy to just go to like a hard hit country, vaccinate a couple thousands of people, and in a couple of weeks or months, you'll know if the vaccine worked. That just doesn't happen in a non-pandemic situation where you don't have so many thousands of simultaneous cases going on. So that's one of the reasons why it has taken barely a year, less than a year, to get functioning vaccines out. Whereas for other diseases that aren't as rampant in the population, it would take as much as a decade. And the fact that, well, it's a major global emergency. We have cut corners in terms of regulatory approval, things like that. There's been exceptions for obvious reasons. Bill Gates is framing this as almost like, wow, what an amazing effort by the pharmaceuticals. How quickly they put out a vaccine, but that's not true. That's not unique to COVID. Like, presumably, if so many billions of public funding were provided for malaria, and every single pharmaceutical company that can produce vaccines suddenly decided that they're going to work on a malaria vaccine, and malaria was infecting millions of people per day around the world, we would probably get a malaria vaccine relatively quickly. Like, it's an issue of the collective effort in terms of financing from governments mostly, not from pharmaceutical companies, from governments. And the fact that we have essentially cut a lot of the regulatory red tape to allow the approval of these vaccines in ways that wouldn't be done. This wasn't like technology magic, which he seems to, he wants to give that impression. And everyone who is against IP waivers, who wants to frame this really as this was an amazing technological effort by the pharmaceuticals, and if we gave IP waivers all the incentives to repeat this amazing turnout in vaccines, just wouldn't happen for the next pandemic. That's ridiculous. That is absolutely ludicrous. Again, repeating something I said in a previous video, these companies, like, no pharmaceutical company is gonna prepare for the next pandemic. That's a fact. There's no incentive to do that. Why would you invest billions on research for diseases that still haven't appeared? No, the effort is going to be made by research institutions, universities, things like that, who will be investing money in non-commercializable research for the possibility of future diseases that may emerge. That's where the money's going to come. That's where the research is going to come, not from the pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceuticals will get in on the action the moment that the next pandemic hits. Yes, of course, because they want to produce a vaccine that could be potentially lucrative. But they're not going to invest today on the diseases of tomorrow. That's a fact. So just erase this idea, erase this argument from your head that this has been just an amazing private sector technology effort, because it hasn't been, right?
In this emergency, partly because of the second source agreements, all the cooperation, the government money, where the UK, France, and Germany actually pulled Act A together with some other actors like the WHO and our foundation, that's made a difference. Because we didn't practice, it's clear that understanding variants and understanding how quickly you can do the regulatory stuff, when this comes up again, we could be a lot smarter. People didn't invest enough in this risk, forming CEPI that the UK and Wellcome and our foundation.
Okay, we'll just leave it at that. Just some final thoughts on Gates's insistence of not even having Oxford, because for me the most egregious part is not so much the IP, the effort at preventing the IP waivers. It's with his intervention with Oxford so that they didn't do what they originally wanted to do. Like, this was just horrible. You had essentially a university that had the capability to develop a vaccine for this disease that is rampaging around the world, and they want to share it, and then this guy comes up and says, no, don't partner with a big pharmaceutical company, keep the IP for yourself, don't share it. Now, if he's insisting that IP waivers don't make a difference, then why, let's use the reverse argument. What was wrong with sharing it from the start? Why did he intervene? Especially knowing that there were going to be other companies that were also working on vaccines. Why did he insist that the one company that could have shared the IP not do it? And the answer is, well, there's two reasons. First of all, Bill Gates has, I think, very strong personal issues with IP, because he has been sued. When he was in Microsoft, he was sued by numerous companies over the course of his stint at Microsoft, most notably by Apple, over Windows, which apparently ripped off the operating system used in the then new Macintosh. The Mac came out in 1984. Microsoft Windows came out, I think, a year or two later. And Microsoft had actually been sort of subcontracted by Apple to produce some things for Apple, and it is the argument was that he stole technology from Apple to make Windows. And this was at a time when software copyright had really just started, so there wasn't really. Basically what I'm saying is I'm not sure he could have pulled it off today with the copyright protections that we have today. Now, Microsoft has basically had a history of not inventing anything. Every major Microsoft product right now has essentially been a ripoff of something someone else has developed. And I have a number of examples. MS-DOS. Microsoft did not develop MS-DOS. It was licensed and later purchased an existing operating system known as 86-DOS. That's 86-DOS. Again, Windows. Microsoft Windows essentially ripped off the Macintosh's operating system. Microsoft Word essentially ripped off WordPerfect. Microsoft Excel essentially ripped off Lotus 1-2-3. Microsoft PowerPoint essentially ripped off Harvard Graphics. And Internet Explorer famously ripped off Netscape. So, again, this is a company that really hasn't invented much. And it has gotten away with it. And I genuinely, I'm not a copyright lawyer, but I suspect that Microsoft, if they did what they did in the 80s with all these applications, if they did the same today, they would have probably gotten sued more than they actually did. And they might have not gotten away from it with it. So I think that's one reason. I think he has a sort of personal issue with IP, and he's kind of projecting it by now, because he knows that he's from he basically built up a company that didn't invent anything and that relied on essentially weak IP existing at the time, that now he has to project by basically becoming an unconditional defender of IP. This is basically the equivalent of like the super conservative preacher or politician who rants about social and moral purity and who's really a closet child molester. The more you act like you're in favor of something is really just projecting the fact that you don't do what you preach. You do the exact opposite. That's projection. That's a psychological term. So I suspect that maybe his fetish with IP is related to the fact that he knows that his company never invented anything. But then the other thing, and I think it's sort of the bigger structural reason, is that IP IP waivers, or just, sort of free dissemination of information, is a threat to all these pharmaceuticals. That is why intellectual protection has been a major component of the global trade system, because it's explicitly done to protect technology that from countries that, when they developed, didn't have those restrictions. Countries like Korea, Taiwan, Japan developed largely by stealing technology, by taking stuff that other countries did, other companies did, making them cheaper, and eventually making them better. And now that helped them develop to the point that now their companies that originally would steal this technology or copy it, stealing is probably a bad word, but copying it and adapting it for local use or whatever, modifying it here or there. Now they're in a position to be leaders in technology, to create new technology rather than copying it. Because now we don't think of Korea or Japan as companies who just reproduce cheap stuff from the West. We know now that what Korean companies, what Japanese companies, what Taiwanese companies produce is very high quality, and it's in many cases better than what the West does. And our current stereotype of China doing the same, I can absolutely guarantee you that in 20, 30 years, because China has managed to get away from all this. China was only a very recent member of the WTO, and it has such a huge market that it can pressure companies to transfer technology as a condition for them to essentially invest in China. So then they take that technology and they run with it. And these are opportunities that are just not feasible for smaller countries. Because no foreign, a foreign company can afford to just say, hey, Chile, if your conditions on FDI are that I share technology, well, you're just a 15 million people market. Why would I bother? So it's no coincidence that the trade regime around the world has essentially moved from focusing on trade, as it did up until like the 80s and maybe beginning of the 90s, into non-trade issues that are largely protectionist. They largely exist to protect the interests of Western companies, because they want to keep having those advantages. If IP waivers existed for coronavirus vaccines, or even if Oxford had shared the blueprints of their vaccine, a vaccine maker that maybe didn't have the technological capacity to create or reproduce a vaccine of this nature suddenly has the blueprints. And those blueprints could maybe unlock an ability to eventually get to a higher level of technological development. So now you have more global vaccine makers with the technology to make a vaccine of the complexity of the coronavirus vaccine. And that's really what they don't want. As long as these pharmaceutical CEOs can keep the technologies for themselves, technologies that, I should add, were largely funded, and certainly like the original research was largely provided by the state. So they're essentially privatizing public spending. They don't want to share that. They don't want any competitors from abroad. The last thing that Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca want is to have not just these 6 or 7 big US, European pharmaceutical companies. They don't want to compete with possibly new Brazilian, South African, Indian, Mexican, whatever companies. That's what they don't want. So this is industrial policy that is not called as such, but it ultimately is industrial policy. And I think one of the mantras of the neoliberal age has been the best industrial policy is no industrial policy. But actually, the best industrial policy since the 80s has been to convince other countries that the best industrial policy is no industrial policy. So anyway, thanks for watching. And if you like this, I would recommend you look at my other coronavirus videos. And of course, like and subscribe, because there's going to be more content. This is a new channel. There's going to be more content like this. Thank you very much.